Hey guys, in today's video we're going to be continuing on our series of how I use the Hunt app. This is our third video in the series, and in the first two I recommend going back and watching those if you haven't already. They're really good for basically a broad overview of how you can start planning your hunt and going over all the different tools that onX offers and all the different resources that they have, even for free. So I'd really recommend going and watch those videos if you haven't already. And now it's time to start diving into the more nitty-gritty of jumping into the details on how you can pick apart your hunting areas based off of just a map, and how we do that using the onX Hunt app and the onX Hunt web mapping. So I'm gonna get right into it, but before we do that, on the first video we gave you guys a chance to win a premium onX membership. And the lucky winner through a random selection on a website was Dan Merck. So congratulations, Dan. It was a hell of an effort you gave commenting down below. So
way to go, Dan.
Way to go, Dan. Woo! Anyway, we'll be replying to that comment on that video and letting you know, and then you can send us a message to send us your address and we'll send you that onX membership. So congratulations, hope you like it. So in this video we're going to be diving into the nitty-gritty of how you can find beds based on a map and bedding areas in general. And these bedding areas can have both does and bucks, but for this video I think they do coincide a lot of times, but for this video it's probably going to be a little bit more tailored to finding buck bedding, because a lot of people are probably interested in that if you're watching this video. So we're going to be taking a look at the onX maps, and it doesn't have to be onX. This can definitely be applied to other mapping systems out there, but we definitely prefer onX, and hence this video series. It's really useful. So we're going to dive into the maps, and first of all I want to talk about the strategy of finding it. A lot of people will just dive straight in to trying to find bedding areas on maps or even in person. But what I like to do is find the food source and then work back from there, because I believe it can be a lot more predictable if you use it that way. And it can be a little bit difficult, especially mapping, figuring out the food sources, but they can be things like ag sources or oak islands or CRP fields that have a lot of diversity. Most generally you can kind of tell where the deer should be feeding, at least the destination food source areas, the ones that they're going to be feeding in and being around all night. And then I like to work backwards from there to find the bedding that they'll be in during the daylight hours. And the reason I do that is because it can be a lot more predictable. Most generally, the does are going to be bedding closer to that food source, and then the bucks are going to be behind that, kind of trying to find their own lair and get away from the social stress of being in a big doe herd. But that all depends on the depth of cover in the area. Sometimes you can have a mile. You can get away from the food sources for a mile, and sometimes it's just a little draw in farm country and they'll only be able to get 50 yards from the food source. And they're really adaptable creatures, whitetails are, so they can handle a lot of different things, and it's all situational. So with that, we'll get into the maps, and I'm just going to go over a couple of different things on our property, even being private land. I'm going to show you the maps and show you how we would pick out buck bedding on our property with an aerial view, and then several different pieces of public land scattered around the country. And I'll try not to give away anyone's secret spots. I know you probably wouldn't like that, but anyway, I think it's going to be very informative and hopefully worth it. So I'm going to turn on the onX maps here and get rolling. Alright, so I've got our farm pulled up here, and I would classify this more or less as kind of farm country, draws, but there is definitely a lot of big timber in the area. I like the mix on our farm. It's got a lot of really diverse habitat, so I actually like it a lot better than big timber. But we'll go over this first, just because it has a lot of different things in it. And I'll actually pull up all of our waypoints. That way we can see our improvements and where we have stands and stuff, and the food sources. So we'll start down here on the bottom left. This used to be an old cow pasture, but now we have switchgrass planted here and across the creek. This is a food source right now, and then a food plot. So in this scenario, let's start with the major destination food source right over here. This is, and it's dependent on the time of year. Sometimes they could be going into the oaks over here and feeding on them, but there's kind of oaks spread out throughout. So I think in this scenario, a lot of times the destination food sources is going to be, what we have planted in the ag destination food sources, which is a whole nother thing. I think if you have ag in an area, it's going to hold a lot more deer in general than an area with just big timber and pastures and stuff. I truly believe that. So, but anyway, we'll start with ag destination food sources and then work back from there. And a lot of these things we're seeing on a map, and I can actually definitely verify that it's bedding just from walking it in person and hunting it last year. So coming up here, this is an area that we rarely go into, and you can see on the maps it's got a lot of really good cover, a lot of diversity. This whole property is really old pasture, so that makes some of the best hunting when it grows up. But we have this nice drainage here, and then a big creek system here. You can see I'm on the hybrid topography feature, so you can see the satellite and the topography changes. And we have a ridge coming down here, and a ridge here, and then a couple ridges falling off down in this valley. So working back from this main food source, I'm going to say a majority of the bedding, a majority of the buck bedding is going to be somewhere over in here, and then somewhere over in here. And then a lot of the doe bedding is going to be closer, probably within 100 yards of this food source. A lot of it's going to occur in this draw, working our way back up in here, all the way around a lot of this stuff. They can be a lot of different areas. But the bucks are going to seek out some of those best bedding locations. So some of the best ones are probably going to be at the end of this ridge. They'll bed a lot on points. I mean, I've spooked bucks off of bedded on points a lot, and coupled with that, if they can have cover at their back and then see out in front of them where the ridge drops off, they're going to really like bedding on those points. So there's definitely a lot of bucks that are going to be bedding on this point. Anywhere on this transition, it's a really steep hill right here. There's a lot of bedding that takes place there, and a lot of buck bedding. There's isolated pockets of trees, kind of similar to a point. If they're in an isolated pocket of trees and they can kind of see down into overgrown grass, stuff like that, they're going to really like bedding in those locations as well. So you're going to be bedding on these points, anywhere on this transition here, these different thick islands of trees. Dropping down into the creek, you could see deer bedding on these different oxbows here where it makes a point, so they're kind of surrounded by this creek system. So they can be a lot of different places, but mainly they're behind the does that are going to be bedded close here, and they're going to be in an advantageous spot. And so, you can't pin it down to the exact tree a lot of times, but I would say one of the better bedding locations in this case is, right here. I think that's probably the first place. If I was going in blind and checking this out, I think the first place that I would expect a buck to be bedded at is pretty much right on this point. It's got a bunch of transitions coming along, and it's a pretty good distance from this food source. A little over 200 yards. So in this farm country scenario, that's actually a lot, given our current depth of cover. Moving over here, a lot of the bedding, it stands out a lot more on some of this stuff where it has a lot of edge, I think. But a lot of the bedding is going to be on the top third of this ridge right here. And as this switchgrass grows up, I think there might be a little bit more bedding out in here, especially on these little islands of trees. You're going to be bedding around that with all that switchgrass, tall cover. But if I was just looking at this on a map and didn't know any of that, I would say that they're going to be bedding on this transition here, and then anywhere on this top third of this ridge, because anytime you're going to have a south wind, it's going to be blowing over that ridge. They're going to get morning thermals during the day coming up the ridge, and it's going to kind of create a wind tunnel along this edge here. So they're going to be bedding all along that ridge, and I know they do. And then again, there's a creek system. They love to bed on waterways. So you can kind of see how I would pick out bedding in those two scenarios based on that destination food source. So we can work way over here. This is kind of our main ag area over here. Now this is very broken terrain, and we start to get a little bit less depth of cover in this part of the farm. Besides this main draw timber block here, we start to get to a lot of pockets, and that's where it does get a little bit less predictable. But I can tell you that you're still going to want to key in on these points. This point here, this point here, this point for sure is definitely a good bedding area. I've sat here and seen bucks cruising and going up in here to bed all morning long, and it's just another one of those points that really stick out. You know, it's far enough away from this food source to where now they can kind of feel like they have their own lair, but it's not too far to where they feel like they have to travel farther than necessary to get to their main destination food source. So they're going to be bedding on any of these points where they can see out. We have several ponds back here, and they love to bed around these ponds. The dam is right here on this one, and they can kind of sit up here on this ridge and dive down and just have plenty of escape routes. And yeah, so I guess if I had to pick out some of the best bedding locations around here, it would probably be here and on some of these points relating to this food source. And then coming off that food source to the southeast, it dives down into something that bucks also really like, is some of these valleys down here where a lot of stuff comes together, and it's pretty steep. We have, I don't know, this main creek system coming together, 2 or 3 more draws, so a lot of things meet up right there. And I can tell you from experience that if you get winds, anything over 8-10 miles an hour, it is just swirling winds like crazy down there, which happens to make it really good and advantageous for bucks to bed in. And there's also a lot of cedars mixed in, so a lot of times you can zoom in and see stuff like this too. So here's the creeks coming together, a lot of stuff right here. Like I said, wind's going to be swirling. It's really hard not to get picked out when you're hunting that, and the bucks know that. And then to couple that, some of the things I also look for when I'm looking for bedding is a lot of cedars. They can bed in a lot of different habitat, but they're going to favor thicker, higher stem count areas, and on transitions, obviously, as well. And so anytime I see cedars, I know that it's going to be a thicker area or dense cedars. And then in this case, there's a nice transition and it's on a point. This was a bed that we found actually, but I can tell you that this whole thing is just going to be loaded with beds and buck beds at that. You know, even though this is a food plot and this is our destination food source, it's very close to the food in this case, but the does have a lot of room to bed, and if this is the best location, I think sometimes you can they're going to defy that rule of bedding deeper into the cover. If that is the best location, they'll bed closer to the food source. And so those are just general guides, not strict rules, but if that's the best location, that's where the bucks are going to be. And so that's a really good area as well. All right, so we've probably gone over our private land property enough to show a lot of the general features that bucks are going to bed around and how we can kind of pinpoint that down. And I guess specifically in a private land case, even though a lot of those features you're going to see carry over, those characteristics that bucks bed and carry over to any type of land that you're going to hunt. But now let's dive into a public land tract that I would consider hunting, and how I would break it down from a mapping perspective and where I think the bucks would bed off of. I'll pick out several areas that I think look like the best spots that a mature buck would be bedding, and that's the areas that I would go into first. And so with public land, we're also, this is still going to be kind of farm country, broken, diverse habitat with ag, just because honestly, if I'm going to a public land area, that's kind of the ones that I'm going to favor. It's the habitat that I think is probably the best, and it's going to hold the most deer in general and mature bucks, which all depends. But that's kind of what I look for a lot. But with the public land, we're not only going to be taking into consideration the food sources, but we're also going to be looking at the access now, the different walking trails, the roads, any sort of access point, and where we think the hunting pressure is going to be. So instead of just looking off of food sources and then backtracking from there, we're also going to be taking a few other things into consideration. But we'll dive right in. I think this property here probably holds mature bucks just because it's big. You can probably get away from the access. So I actually had this in planning a whitetail hunt, a Midwestern hunt, part of this series, and I noticed that this area over here is definitely something that could potentially get overlooked. I love it when there's like a parking lot or something, and then there's areas where people can get really far off the road or feel like they're getting really far off the road. Because most generally, in my opinion, a lot of the hunting pressure is going to be within a couple hundred yards of the parking lot, or it's going to be fairly deep back in there, and people are going to be trying to get away from hunting pressure, or feel like they are at least, by trying to go the furthest back in, and that might not always be the case. So in areas like these, like this is probably honestly the first thing I would check out. A ton of people are going to go past all of this stuff or hunt like right in here if they're the people who want to hunt with easy access. This is some of the first stuff I would check out because it's kind of in this corner, tucked away corner that might get overlooked. Diving into that, I'd say this is probably going to be the destination food source for this area here. You can see we have a nice pond here for a water system, a lot of broken habitat. I'd say in this scenario, given the ridges, I think some of the first things I would check out would probably be like right here along this pond and kind of this point here. They can overlook this stuff. Maybe this point, maybe this transition right here, and then that's going to give a lot of room for him to browse around. There's probably oaks, acorns, stuff like that, different woody browse. And then they can kind of come out into this destination food source area here. They have water, and like I said, I think that's probably one of the first areas I would check out. I think is a buckwood bed here. So that's one that might be a little bit overlooked. Moving on from that, kind of like it down here. This is kind of another one of those scenarios where, hey, you're not that far off the access, so a lot of people might be walking by it. But you're also tucked up to next to some private land, which could be managed, could be not. They could have big deer. They could be overhunting it and pushing deer into the public. Who knows? And so, but it's kind of a corner where you're tucked away from people. And, food source here, it looks like, or at least browse. Definitely probably some oaks and some hardwoods that they can browse on, different stuff like that. But most generally, probably looking at a lot of movement coming out this way. It's hard to say in this case, but I would say a lot of bedding that's probably taking place right in here on this point. Really brushy, looks like. Bedding on this point where they can kind of see down, and they can also kind of hop over both edges of the edge of the ridge whenever pressure comes in. But also some security cover in there. I'd probably check out this point first. So that's one of the first areas I would check out. If we want to go super deep, we'll go give a scenario there. In that case, let's look at this river. Ton of bedding around rivers. That doesn't look like, so that's still pretty far off the access there. Wish there was a good bend in this river so it would kind of have a place that jumped out at me. That's another corner that could definitely be overlooked just because it's kind of sectioned out. I'd take a look at that, but we've kind of gone over those. So here's some good bends in the river that I would definitely check out, and kind of farther off the axis. I definitely check out some of this stuff. This looks like it's probably really thick stuff in person. And they're kind of surrounded by waterway, and then looks like a lot of thick areas. They're probably going to be bedding in there. A lot of times they'll bed on points of rivers, so they're kind of surrounded by water to block some predators. So I check out some of that stuff. But I guess we're probably getting into the video here a lot, so let's move on from this one. Let's look at some big woods bedding, and then maybe some river bottom type stuff, and then we'll probably wrap it up from there. Alright, so we won't spend too much time on this, honestly, just because it's really monotonous habitat. But let's look at a big wood scenario. I'd say most of the bedding is going to be on these points. Any sort of point that looks like it has some thick stem count areas, like maybe some cedars, like on this point here. That could be pretty good on that point, overlooking that creek bottom. Could be getting some swirling winds, wind coming over the top of this hill, even overlooking the access in this scenario here. That could be a pretty good bedding area that I'd check out. There's a pond right there. A lot of the points are going to be some of the stuff that I check out, even the smaller ones, especially where a lot of them come together, like right in here. There's a point here, point here, point here. Definitely a lot of swirling winds there, and a lot of deer are going to be congregating and stuff like that. There's a saddle right here. It might be good to hunt them in. They're probably going to be doing a lot of feeding on these ridge tops, depending on the time of year. There might be acorns, and that could be kind of the food source that you're kind of working off of in that scenario. But again, you're still trying to figure out where these higher stem count areas are, and then pretty much focusing on the points beyond that. And I know this video is getting long, so I'm not really sure how much I want to add to the big woods bedding. But bottom line, you're still looking for that diversity, whether it be topography or change in stem count, and trying to identify the food. It just gets a little bit harder in the big wood scenarios. So let's go to a river bottom piece and then wrap this up. That fan is really going on my computer. Hopefully that's not too loud on the audio. But anyway, here's a river bottom piece. Looks like you can get away from some of the access. I'm sure it's not that fun to walk through, so I bet there's probably some big deer in here. A lot of times in these river bottom pieces or wet areas, if you can go through any kind of water, you're going to escape a ton of hunting pressure, and the deer probably aren't going to care that much. Within reason, deer are pretty tough and they can handle a lot of that. So a lot of times if you can cross like an oxbow lake that's kind of isolated and it blocks off some of your access, they're going to be bedding beyond that, and a lot of times they can get really big in places like down in there. Some of the food sources might be a little bit different. You're going to get any islands with woody browse are going to be kind of the food sources there. When they're surrounded by marsh grass and different types of just wet area grasses, they're going to be eating on woody browse a lot more than the grasses. So that's what you can kind of take in consideration for the food sources a lot of time. And then obviously your more traditional stuff like ag food sources, you can still relate it from there. But again, you're going to be looking at bends of the rivers. Those are always good places for bucks to bed, along different ponds and oxbow lakes. Wherever there's a nice transition, you can find like islands of trees. A lot of times you can zoom in too, depending on the time of year the imagery was taken, and you can see a lot of the trails. But a lot of times they'll be coming off of any islands of trees will be really good bedding. Actually, let's go to, well, here you can see some trails crossing. Let's go to one that shows it really well. A lot of times you'll be able to find some areas where the trails are going to look like a tire sprocket coming out of, and it might be like on an island or something, and that's a really good indication that there's going to be some bedding in there, and that's definitely something I would check out. If trails are coming, I'll just zoom into one that I know. Like right here, look at all these trails. You can see this from the aerial photo. These are just really beat down, and a lot of them are leading to this thick pocket of willows right here. There's an oxbow lake here, and then there's some ag food sources up in this direction, and then also some wooded oak ridges that are going to drop a lot of acorns. So a lot of times the food sources, the destination is going to be up this way, and then the rivers to the south, marsh right here, and oxbow lake. And look at all these trails coming in and diverging to this pocket of willows right here. That's definitely going to be a spot that I'm going to mark to check out as a potential buck bed and buck bedding area. So anyway, let's go ahead and cut it off here. I know I didn't dive too in depth on those last two scenarios with the river bottom and big woods scenarios. Given all the information in this video, you can hopefully start to figure it out for yourself and see that they're going to be bedding along those transitions and those higher stem count areas, and it's very situational, but hopefully through all those examples you can kind of start to pick up on it. And a lot of times with these mapping systems, you can pick a point on the map, go there, and there's going to be a buck bedding in there, and so you can cut out a ton of legwork with systems like onX, or you can use Google Earth too, but onX just puts everything right where you need it. So but anyway, this can be applied to public land, private land, whatever you hunt and whatever situation you're in. But I think we're going to go ahead and cut off the video here. So if you learned something and you liked the video, make sure you hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to see future content. Thanks for watching.